Welcome to Sounds, the podcast where we bring you in-depth conversations and some of the most influential voices in film, music, and culture. I'm your host, Tom Needham, and today we're joined by Billy Baldwin, an acclaimed actor and activist who serves as the narrator for the powerful new documentary Fentanyl Death Incorporated. Fentanyl Death Incorporated is the most comprehensive documentary ever made on the fentanyl crisis and an epidemic that has become the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. The film exposes the catastrophic impact of the drug, which is 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. And for those in New York, the film will be having a special one-day screening on March 7th at the AMC Empire 25 Street. You can visit FDImovie.com for details and to secure tickets. Billy, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is a very powerful film, a very important film. What drew you to this story in the first place?
Well, I've been involved with the Cuomo family since the 80s and homelessness. I sort of, got married, had children, and told everybody to lose my number for a while I was, busy raising my family. And lo and behold, my kids are off to college and we're having empty nests. I get invited to do this film on homelessness called No Address with Beverly D'Angelo and Xander Berkeley, Ashanti, Ty Pennington. That opened on Friday. And while we were prepping that film, we went on a 20-city, 18-state tour interviewing federal, state, local, nonprofit, faith-based interviews. And we spun off a documentary on homelessness called Americans with No Address. My producer on those two projects was Donald Trump's homelessness czar, Dr. Robert Marbut. And we got along like a house on fire. We thought we would be battling and pointing the finger and having arguments about politics on the set all day. And we found tremendous consensus, tremendous opportunity. These are slam dunks: homelessness, fentanyl, mental health, but even in trickier issues like money and politics and the Second Amendment. And we realized, like, we sit here and we scream at each other like we're arguing, but we agree on 75-80% of this issue. So we got to get back to the old days of Bob Dole and Tip O'Neill, where people, got in a room and locked the door and said, now you can't leave, and they got something done.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem that's affecting everybody. The statistics in the movie are staggering. Why do you think fentanyl is still not widely understood by the public?
Well, what happened was when you had the Purdue pharma crisis and all the lawsuits, you had millions of Americans that were hooked on, Percocet and oxycodone and everything. And because of those lawsuits, it was much more strictly, regulated, and those scripts weren't being written, and it caused a market that was filled by the Mexican cartels were bringing in cocaine and meth and other drugs. And all of a sudden, when there was this collapse in the opioid market, the Chinese started sending the precursors to the Mexican cartels. It started coming through the southern border, but the biker gangs up in Canada have set up super labs up in Canada, and the threat from Alaska and the threat along the northern border is just as great as the southern border. And some of the numbers are scary and staggering. We are, excuse me, we have lost since 2019 more people to fentanyl than World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, every operation that we've had globally since 1939. More casualties, more deaths from fentanyl than we had casualties in combat since 1939. 75,000 people die. That's a conservative number because it's being underreported. 75,000 people die a year. 58,000, 59,000 died in Vietnam over 15 years.
So why isn't the mainstream media really reporting these numbers and making people understand where the real problem is?
We have a lot of, what Steve Bannon referred to as, I think he referred to it as like muzzle velocity. There's so much stuff that's sort of thrown out there that the media bites onto, and they're too busy, focusing on Canada being the 51st state or the Gulf of America, and they're not. These numbers are so staggering that we should be running. We have a full-fledged five-alarm crisis in this country right now, and it's not just killing homeless people and mentally ill people on the street. It's killing. The founder of YouTube lost her son, 18 years old, at some party at Berkeley last year. He went to a party, somebody passed him a pill, he took the pill, he didn't wake up the next day. So this is happening to poor people, it's happening to minorities, and it's happening in the white affluent community. I raised my children in Santa Barbara, oddly enough, more diverse than you would think. Their high school 63% ethnicity and 40-something% government assistance. And there's been numerous, every community, like you used to say 20 years ago, have you been touched by breast cancer? Yes, my mother, my aunt, my sister, my grandmother, my best friend's mother. Same thing with fentanyl now. You cannot, if you had a room of 30 people, 28 of them would raise their hand and say, I've been directly or indirectly affected by a fentanyl death over the last 5 years. So it's pervasive. The problem was not helped. And it's very interesting now that we have the left talking to the right. I've done this before in other issues. I've gone and lobbied Congress, and I've gone to testify in the House and the Senate, and I've gone to every Democratic and Republican convention since 1988. And as a liberal, I don't need to talk to the left. I need to talk. When I would go to the Hill to lobby, I would be talking to Dennis Hastert and Orrin Hatch, and that was a much more valuable conversation for me because I had an opportunity to help educate them. And a lot of times I would be with them and they would turn to their chief of staff and say, is what Baldwin is saying right? Is that true? Is that accurate? And they would say, yes, it is. And they were like, okay, how can I help? And a lot of times you have the left that is what I call, the sort of the compassionate side that will throw a bunch of stuff against the wall, and they come in with these civil liberty issues like low harm, no harm, and housing first. Well, 15 years later, we realized you can't take a drug addicted, mentally ill. It's great that you got them off the street. It's great that you got them housing. But if you take a mentally ill a fentanyl addict and put them in housing, your problem does not go away. And when I'm talking to the right, which I would not say they lack compassion, but they're trying to figure out who's going to pay for this and who's going to be responsible for paying for this. And I say, you're paying more right now to not do enough. And they're like, what does that mean? And I see there's thousands of calls, 9/11 calls every day. In Spokane, when I was there, they had 6 calls for the same person in the same day. I watched people flatline and die. I've watched them flatline and be brought back from fentanyl and then refuse care. When you make the 911 call, fire department, sheriff, cops, paramedics, nonprofits, cost the taxpayer. Emergency room, taxpayer. They're admitted to the hospital, taxpayer. They go into the court system, then they're incarcerated, taxpayer. Small business affairs, commerce, tourism, quality of life, property values dropping because homelessness went from 4,000 to 17,000 in Sacramento over COVID. It's destroying Spokane. It went from 54,000 to 76,000 in LA County. So the numbers are absolutely staggering, but there is hope. They're doing amazing, comprehensive 360 work in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in San Antonio, in Austin, in Pinellas, Florida, in Sacramento, California. And there's this great Christian mission in Baltimore who's partnering with secular Johns Hopkins Medical Center, and they're doing amazing work. They built a facility, Johns Hopkins built a facility in the second floor of the mission. And the work that Johns Hopkins is getting done with this mission in Baltimore, they're having over a 70% success rate of getting people on their feet, totally self-sufficient, totally independent, back to work, off the services, off the government services. They're no longer a liability to the American taxpayer. So they're doing great work. We have to replicate that county by county, state by state. And look, if we could, in the next 5 to 10 years, if we can eradicate 20 or 30% of this, it's going to be cost effective. But some of these organizations are having 60, 70, 75% success rate.
Billy, that's really fascinating. You mentioned earlier, though, 3 countries. You mentioned China, Mexico, and Canada. And this film is very, very powerful. It certainly makes the case that these countries are very directly responsible for the fentanyl that's pouring into our country. Can you educate our listeners a little bit about what exactly is going on?
Well, yeah, the Mexico used to bring in, meth and cocaine, and now they're bringing in fentanyl because there's a market after the collapse of the market due to this. I don't remember the name, how you pronounce the lesson, the Sacklov family or whatever, in the Purdue
Mm.
opioid lawsuits. So they filled that void, and now there's more coming in with the biker gangs in the super labs in Canada. So we have to protect the border. We have to go after China. But the fact of the matter is, we have nobody to blame but ourselves. Why do we have 4.2% of the world's population and we consume 65% of the fentanyl? I'm sorry, we consume 38% of the world's fentanyl, and we have 65% of the world's deaths. That's not Mexico's fault. That's not China's fault. We have to approach this from the demand side and the supply side. This stuff is lethal, and it's very it's very difficult to get off of. And of course, I blame China. Of course, I blame Canada and Mexico. Of course, we have to do something about that. But if we're not simultaneously doing something on the demand side, no, it's not going to work.
So
Remember,
there's a lot that has to be done. You're saying.
in the 1830s, I believe, the British Empire, when they took over Hong Kong, they were bringing opioids into is so profitable, and they were weakening. They were destroying Chinese culture. And I wouldn't say that the Chinese government is Chinese government is saying it's payback time for what the British did to us, 2 centuries ago. But if you want to destabilize a culture and a society, getting people hooked on a drug that's 50 times more addictive than heroin, and 100 times more addictive than methadone, and is completely, I mean, literally 2-3 grains of salt of fentanyl could kill 100 people. I mean, the dosage between living and dying is microscopic, and also the stuff that they're putting in here. Some of this stuff that's coming in that's stamped as a pill that people think that they're taking that's fentanyl doesn't even have fentanyl in it. It has all these weird precursors and precursors, and some of it has xylazine, which is a horse tranquilizer. There's literally people on the streets. I was, in the encampments in Spokane and Seattle, and I was with people talking to them that were, 1 minute they were having a conversation with me, and the next minute they were bent over in what they refer to as the fentanyl fold, and they were bent over, nodded out. You've seen it, either walking down the street or you've seen it online. And I've seen dozens of people that are flatlining, dozens of people that were revived by Narcan, and it's just brutally addictive. And we have to do something about it, and we have to do it now because it's going to get worse, and it's either we pay. If we don't pay the price now, we're going to be paying far greater later. And in the form, like I said, small business, tourism, commerce, property values, quality of life. We need to address this issue now.
Billy, in this movie that you narrate, it's really daunting because it's pointed out in the film that a lot of people think about just the border down in Mexico, but there's this part in the movie where they kind of go section by section in the country, and they point out that California, the whole West Coast, is an entry point.
Yeah,
Obviously,
the
the
Gulf of the
Canadian
Gulf of Gulf of Mexico, the Carolinas, the border in the north is the longest border between two countries in the world. And we have people that are up there that are doing border control that are not patrolling in these remote areas because they're on their computers dealing with doing paperwork and doing filings from the southern border. The southern border grabs somebody and it goes into the system, and they're doing the filings and the paperwork up in Maine and in Minnesota and in North Dakota and along the coast with British Columbia, because that's how backlogged they are, rather than being out checking on one of the borders there in the wilderness, or on a river, patrolling a river. They're busy dealing with the southern border while they're working on the northern border.
Wow, it's unbelievable. A lot of people know you, Billy, from your work in Hollywood. Some people feel that Hollywood could be doing more to educate the public about what's going on? What do you think?
Oh, I just made this documentary,
Yeah.
and I just made another documentary on homelessness, and I just made a feture film on homelessness. We spent, the documentaries aren't as expensive, but the film was, millions of dollars, and we're trying to raise awareness because we're dealing with this on a level that's never happened before. And we used to have, again, I don't look at it as a fentanyl crisis or a homelessness crisis. I look at it more as a mental health crisis. It's going through the roof, and we used to have 500,000 federal beds across the country in the 50s and 60s. Those beds have been cut to 30,000, and most of those beds, if you're convicted in court of guilty by reason of insanity, you're occupying most of those 30,000 beds. So the people that are getting taken off the streets and they're going into treatment facilities, it's not being funded by. During the Reagan era, there was a partnership between the Republicans that didn't want didn't think it was the job of the federal government to pay for something like that, and liberals who literally saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and saw what happened to McMurphy and how he was held, and they lobotomized him. And they said, okay, if you're not going to fund it, we want to make sure that you can't just law enforcement can't just pick people up off the street and hold them against their will, or families like the Kennedys when they put away President Kennedy's sister, and they wanted to protect the rights of these people, and now both sides are talking to each other saying we need to course correct. Republicans and conservatives are saying this is now getting to a point where it's hitting, my pocketbook personally, in my quality of life, my property value, my property taxes. Something has to be done. And the left is saying, wow, these well-intended programs of low harm and no harm and housing first are not working. You can't take a mentally ill homeless person who's addicted to fentanyl and simply put them in housing and think the problem is going to go away. You've gotten them off the street, that's great. You've gotten them into housing, that's great. The problem hasn't gone away. So both sides are now talking to each other. And if we look at this and framing this more as a mental health crisis that's gotten worse in the last 10, 15 years than in American history, and you have the right and the left having at a moment where they have the political will to at least talk to one another about this and consider working with one another on this because it's gotten so bad, we have this great opportunity. And if we could replicate what they're doing in Fort Smith and San Antonio and Johns Hopkins, county by county, state by state, 10, 15 years from now, we can make we can have huge gains, huge gains.
Well, Billy, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. We've been speaking with Billy Baldwin, and we're talking about his film, Fentanyl Death Incorporated. There's going to be a special one-day screening on March 7th at AMC Empire 25 on 42nd Street. You can find out about tickets at fdimovie.com. And Billy, this is such an important issue, and I hope that everyone out there will go out and see this film. Is there any place that people, if they can't make it to this screening, if they're listening outside the area, how can people find out more about this movie?
Yeah, fdimovie.com, and that'll have all the information for when we get our distribution and what theaters it'll be in and where you'll pick up later streaming. We're in negotiation with a major distributor for this. They really like it, and we want to get it into theaters and get it streaming, but we want to use it as an educational tool. We may have to recut it. Right now, it's fine for university and high school consumption, but we would like to use it in the junior high and elementary school level where it's age appropriate to heighten awareness about this. We would do a second edit on that and change some of that content to not scare fifth and sixth graders too much, but they need, they do sex education in some public schools,
Right.
and I don't know what grade it starts in that fourth, fifth, sixth grade. So these kids should see this in a way that I don't want them to have nightmares about it, but I want them to be aware of it because the number one cause of death in America between 18 and 45 is not cancer. It's not heart disease. It's fentanyl overdoses. And the fastest climbing death rate between 1 and 5 is fentanyl because these kids are at a play date at a friend's house, they touch a surface, they lick their hand, they die of an overdose. So the rising number one cause of 3 and 4-year-olds is also fentanyl. So we've got to do something to make sure we get the word out there for parents and families.
Thank you very much, Billy. I appreciate you coming on the show and spreading the word.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you again. And if there's anything I can do when you get the distribution or if you're bringing it out into schools, I'd love to have you on again to talk more about it.
Okay, great. And reach out to send the same message to whoever you coordinated this with. It might have been Judy, the publicist. If it was, have your office just send that information out and tell them that we discussed that, and we could circle back and do something again when it's being released in theaters. We thought it was going to be May 7th, world wide, go wide on screens. But now with this new distribution partner, it's going to be up to them. If we close the deal with them, then they're going to determine when it's going to be released. It may or may not be May 7th.
I will send the message to Judy, and really powerful film. Thank you so much. I know you're super busy.
Yeah.
I hope the screening goes well today and everything with the distribution.
Thanks for watching. Appreciate
Okay.
it. Thanks for helping us get the word out.
Of
Bye-bye.
course. Yeah. Take it easy. Nice talking with you.
You too. Bye now.